I'd like to welcome everyone to the second webinar that TRISA is sponsoring, the Travel Rule Information Sharing Alliance, as TRISA is known for, has been working tirelessly for the last 5+ years on trying to find a unifying solution for travel rule compliance. This series of webinars is intended to focus on what is happening around the world as major steps have been made toward implementing relatively standard rules of operation in different jurisdictions. And our third webinar, which is scheduled for November 21st, will focus on the TRISA solution and how it's addressing the privacy and security related issues that have become very much predominant in the conversations around good travel rule compliance. With that, I'd like to welcome our two speakers today, Simone Martin and Andrew Davidson, representing two very distinct areas of the world to complement our conversation last week on what is happening in the EU around the MICA implementation. So with that, I'd like Simone and Andrew to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started.
Well, thank you so much, Carol. My name is Simone Martin, and I am the Director of Special Projects at the BVI Financial Services Commission. But I am here in my personal capacity, and I'm also the CEO and founder of Ignis Solutions Limited, a company that's focused on compliance trainings. And in terms of my background with TRISA, I've been with the TRISA working group since I think fall 2020, which is surprising how fast time flies. But in that time, I've also been working in Anguilla, FSC on secondment, and I've had fabulous opportunities to engage with my counterparts in different parts of the world, but of course, with focus in the Caribbean region. So I'll just stop there for the introduction and sure to get Andrew in as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Simone, and thanks, Carol. So my name's Andrew Davidson. My day job is I'm CTO for VDX, is my background, which is a hopefully soon to launch VASP that's applied for the license here in Hong Kong. I'm based in Hong Kong. I was previously the CTO at the first licensed exchange in Hong Kong. And that's how I've been doing travel rule stuff, because I'm really a technology guy, not a compliance person. But similarly, I can't remember the exact date, but it's been 4 or 5 years. Been doing something, desperately trying to get it possible to comply with the travel rule, and really started when I was CTO at the other shop, because nothing really existed. And yet we were having to comply with the travel rule on a voluntary basis. There was a sandbox regime at the time, and so we needed to at least make an effort. So as part of that, I've been chair of the travel rule protocol working group, which eventually merged into OpenVASP. And we've been working very, very closely with Edwin and others at TRISA, particularly on interoperability and specifically through great work, again, Edwin and Benjamin, mostly from rotational, building the TRISA bridge, which is now rolled into the Envoy product, to basically allow people who have implemented the travel rule protocol to also interoperate with TRISA, which we'll probably get to this later, but interoperability is a good thing. Yeah, that's about a good enough introduction. Thank you, Carol.
Well, it's a great introduction to a number of different points that we'd like to cover today. So I'd like to first start with Simone. And as background, in our conversations on the last webinar, we talked about the fact that the deadline for compliance with the travel rule in the EU is rapidly approaching us in the next less than 60 days now, with maybe a little grace period after that. We know the U.S. has had an expectation of travel rule compliance really from the get-go, reiterated, and I underscore reiterated, not said for the first time, in 2015 in conjunction with actions taken against Ripple with respect to by the Department of Justice and FinCEN. So that travel rule compliance is nothing new in the U.S. Whether we have seen enforcement that goes along with it, that's another question. In the EU, what we heard the other day is that, yes, we've got a deadline coming, that it is going to be a very different kind of a world, that there is an expectation from the get-go that entities will be subject to or will be compliant. It's not a matter of if or when I'm going to finally get everything into place, but they will be held accountable from day one. So I was hoping you could tell us, what what the status of travel rule compliance looks like in Caribbean and some of the forces that have driven the Caribbean region to address these issues in the way that they are.
Well, thank you for that, Carol. I think it's good to have a bit of a requiem in terms of the global landscape, especially with David here from Hong Kong. We have always been focused on what FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, has issued in relation to any new development impacting industries. And that, of course, goes for regulatory authorities and private sector. And of course, Carol, you would be familiar with the first document that FATF put out a report late 2018 regarding virtual asset service providers and certain risks. And in that time, there's been a certain building of capacity, which led to the introduction of the travel rule in 2019. And of course, that filters down to the rest of the FSRB, so FATF-style regional bodies. And for the purposes of this discussion, I'm focusing on members of the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, which tends to neatly ring-fence Caribbean members. And so just as a backdrop, there's a lot of compliance requirements that have been in place for years in the subgroup that would be known as the British Overseas Territories, of which the British Virgin Islands is a part of. So it is a requirement for you to comply with travel rules and for a VASP to be licensed or registered in the British Virgin Islands, in Cayman Islands, in Anguilla, and definitely in Bermuda. You also have other jurisdictions like Bahamas that were leaders in the space. Bahamas was the first country on the planet to introduce its own CBDC, and they have continued that momentum in terms of embracing innovation. Now, I did a look back, I think about 18 months ago, in terms of where the Caribbean was at in terms of travel rule compliance and regulation of virtual asset service providers. And it's kind of sad to say that there's not been too much of a change. Relatively new to entering the regulated space has been Belize, St. Martin, and Curacao. So this is the Dutch side. You also have Trinidad showing up with legislation since I did that last review. But there's so many other jurisdictions that are still working on legislation and taking a look at some of the websites from competent authorities. So it may be their version of the FSC or central bank or financial intelligence unit. They have put out public advisory warnings for the public, but they're still trying to grapple how they're going to bring this into the fold. Now, it's important to say that recommendations 15 and 16 would still apply to all Caribbean jurisdictions. So even if it is that they don't have a specific law in place, they're being reviewed, and I think almost all of the countries in the Caribbean have gone through the 4th round review, and if they haven't, they're about to finish that process. And so that is a part of the evaluation that they will be assessed on. And if they're not compliant, it will show up, it will have dire consequences for the jurisdiction in that assessment process. So compliance with the travel rule required, but there's a lot of nebulous space in some of the jurisdictions that do not have legislation. And some of those jurisdictions include Jamaica, Panama. Panama is a big jurisdiction for international business within the region. We have Aruba still not having concrete legislation. Turks and Caicos Islands, which is the only overseas territory, British overseas territory that falls outside of the group, and the Eastern Caribbean Union. They are under a group regulatory structure similar to the EU. And I think that there's work being done. I recall seeing some public releases from their regulatory authority. And that's for a large portion of the Caribbean, English-speaking Caribbean. So islands like Dominica, Grenada, St. Lucia would all fall under this. They have not yet brought to bear a single regulatory document, but we've seen how difficult it was in the EU. And I think that this is a good example of, smaller countries that have more latitude, being more nimble and being able to bring these things into force, bring laws into force as far back as 2020 in some cases. Whereas when you have unions, blocks, or bigger countries, it can be a bit more difficult.
Thank you. And I guess the same type of overview, Andrew, I know you're in Hong Kong, but certainly observing what is going on around you.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. So yeah, probably start with Hong Kong because that's what I'm most familiar with because I'm based here. And on that note, I mean, one of the things, the misconceptions I think is that Asia and even Asia Pacific is sort of this homogenous thing and that everything's the same. And it couldn't be further from the truth. There's a lot of rivalry between different countries and jurisdictions, a lot of competition for attracting business, and therefore there's, from a regulatory point of view, there's sort of positioning trying to be attractive while depending on who they're trying to attract, and I think that's probably the biggest variation across the region is, some places are trying to attract or reassure and attract traditional finance into virtual assets and doing that in a safe way. Others are seeing the opportunity of a new asset class, potentially things that they haven't done before. Maybe they're not so strong on traditional finance, and they're maybe having, how do I say it politely, slightly easier to comply with regulations and enforcement. I think enforcement is a really interesting topic here. So in terms of Hong Kong, where I am, so as I mentioned before, initially they've gone a very gradual, starting very narrow, and then widening out approach. So when first got involved in this, I can't remember when it was, 2019 or something like that. It was an opt-in sandbox, regulatory sandbox, which was sort of co-discovering how to do this from a regulatory point of view. From Hong Kong's obviously a relatively established traditional finance hub, and so most of the regulators here were not experienced with digital assets, and they've hired in and trained and stuff since then. But initially, it's fair to say back then that they weren't so familiar. So there was this sandbox which you could opt into, but very, very restricted, spot only, nothing fancy at all, and professional investors only, which is similar to the accredited investors in the US. And yeah, in that landscape, especially back in 2019, 20, there was nobody else doing travel rule, so it was very, so it was kind of on a best efforts basis. I think now, as we've the last 4 or 5 years, I think almost every country, at least in Asia, has officially got some legislation, at least the major economies here, for the travel rule, but actual enforcement and day-to-day usage varies greatly across the region. Some of it, and it also does vary between whether people are doing retail-based or institutional-based, or sometimes more B2B. I think the biggest difference there, obviously, that the number of transactions on a retail basis is much higher. For places where that's the case, places like South Korea, quite often a single vendor solution has kind of dominated, either through local agreements or between the various VASPs or something, because the technology has been quite fragmented. And hence why interoperability is so important. So you've got people like Verify VASP in South Korea who've got basically the entire market. But that leads to these islands of interoperability that don't talk to each other, and that's really problematic, because if you need to do things across those islands between jurisdictions, it can be very, very difficult unless each VASP ends up implementing half a dozen vendors and different protocols and things. So and I think that's where things like TRISA and TRP comes in, being open, because they can help to be a common way of speaking between those islands. And so I think to date, a lot of where that has happened is there's been a lot of encouragement in some of the jurisdictions where you're allowed to do this to not have VASP to VASP transfers at all, where basically people have non-custodial wallets, they're self-hosted wallets, where they need to prove ownership and control of those wallets. And if so, a lot of the actual transfers have been sent to those, and then not subject to the travel rule. And that's it seems to be the way a lot of the jurisdictions at this point in time, and the VASPs in the jurisdictions where they're allowed to do that are doing that. But obviously that's not great. So yeah, and I think Hong Kong specifically is the local regulator here, the SFC, has the principle they call same product, same risk, same rules. And what they're really talking about that is blending it with traditional finance. So the legislation here is it came into effect in June this year. It was officially came into effect in well, there was a grace period prior to that, but it's totally in effect now, and you basically have to comply, and using the only thing you can do is in that case of sending to a non-custodial wallet, that's if you can't get a VASP talking to another VASP, that's how you have to do it. So that's a little bit about Asia.
Well, thank you very much. I guess there are a couple of questions that you pointed me to in your comments. One of which was Hong Kong, where you sit, it's fully effective now. How many licensed VASP are there? Does it apply, one, just to licensed VASP? Two, how many are there, and how many are sort of in the pipeline? And
yeah. This is a sore point. We're all amongst friends now, so I can talk reasonably clearly. So there's currently in Hong Kong specifically, there's only 3 fully licensed VASPs. Only one of those was only approved about a month ago and is not live yet. And there's a lot of disquiet about the how few that is. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of competition, and it seems, at least in Hong Kong, seems to be a lot of talk between Singapore and Hong Kong. I think there's something like 40-something, 50 licensed VASPs in Singapore, for example, and there's 3 currently here. There's about as the deadline to the having to comply around there's I think there was at one point 14 applicants in addition to the 2 at that time that had actually got the license, and I think we're down to 11 now. Some of those were pulled out. Recently, last week was what they call FinTech Week here in Hong Kong, and at that FinTech Week, the SFC did announce that they were trying to accelerate the approval of some of the applicants, and they they hinted that likely before the end of the year there may be more, but they didn't say how many. I think in terms of just the sheer numbers, I think does reflect a little bit of the different approach between Hong Kong and Singapore. I think the Singapore, if we wind back 4 or 5 years, the Singapore basically said, "Hey, come to Singapore if you want to do crypto. It's awesome, and you'll be able to do all these different products, including derivatives and sort of that." So a lot of people went there. If you they had a grandfathering regime, so if you did a few trades before the deadline, you were allowed to continue to operate until your license was either approved or rejected. So a lot of people did that, but then I think then FTX happened, which the National Wealth Fund was a big investor in, and that really made them reconsider and tighten things down a little bit. You've actually had, even though there's more licenses, I think there's quite a few businesses that have actually given up their licensing in Singapore, at least temporarily. For example, the company I worked for was the first license in Hong Kong, had applied in Singapore and was grandfathered in, and ended up withdrawing their license application in Singapore. And some of the other businesses that were doing more exotic things have, I think, quietly been told to pull their head in a little bit. So I think that's interesting. I think that neither is right or wrong. They're both compliant with the travel rule, but it is a different approach. Whereas I think being a maybe slightly larger traditional finance center, I think the local regulator here, again, the same product, same risk, same rules thing, have really tried to align the regime here with traditional finance so that licensed intermediaries can better transact with virtual assets.
Well, I also appreciated your comment about people thinking Southeast Asia is a ubiquitous term. One of the things we heard last week with respect to what is happening in the EU is that MiCA is a general law that applies across the EU, but each country has to implement it separately, and it sounded like we're in various degrees of implementation at this point, even with the pending deadline of December 31st. I hope you also can appreciate, to play that out into the US, is that we have 50 states and a very disparate group of 50 states in that regard as well. So I think we all feel the pain on multiple levels. I guess I'd like to turn, Simone, to you. I think many people, when they think Caribbean region, are thinking primarily BVI and the Caymans with respect to crypto activity, and I guess, yes, Bahamas occasionally. But can you comment on what the status is with respect to the BVI? I think there's been some recent announcements in that regard.
Yeah, sure. So I am not involved in any regulatory activity given my different roles, but in the last few months, we've had, I think it's either 4 or 6 of the first tranche of VASPs licensed, and those would be on the Commission's website. But beyond that, last year at a forum, it was publicly disclosed by 2 service providers that they had submitted approximately a combined number of 60 applications to the Commission. So, they were telling their own story in terms of how many applications would have been at the Commission. And it's not a secret that the BVI has attracted a number of players even before the dust started to settle around regulatory regimes globally. One only has to go to CoinGecko or one of the other websites and look at the place of incorporation for whether it be an exchange or a project or what have you, and you would see BVI popping up quite often. Cayman had to push as well in terms of their legislation, and it wasn't from a competitive vantage point, or maybe, I don't know, I'm not speaking for anyone in the Cayman Islands, but they had their mutual evaluation in 2018. And then when they were being reviewed in 2019, they got downgraded for recommendations 15 or 16 or both. And so they didn't have the laws in place. So they then had to rushed to fix that and make sure that they had a clear regulatory framework for that. It is typically known that Cayman and BVI were the major jurisdictions for hedge funds to be registered or recognized in either jurisdiction. And so as an extension, I think the businesses that have gravitated towards our shores have had connections with traditional financial services players that have been in existence in our shores for, in some cases, 5 decades. That extends a bit to Bermuda as well. So Bermuda was one of the first Caribbean countries that had a mutual evaluation, and it stands as one of the best on the planet for AML-CFT compliance. They had elections, and their new premier and deputy premier were very technologically focused. So they had innovated on the legislative front, but in terms of the numbers of actual players, it's not as many. And just to go back to Andrew's point in terms of regulating in the space, one of the challenges that I've seen and heard from other regulators around the world and service providers is that the lack of regulatory clarity has caused some challenges. So the sandbox situation was a situation that allowed regulators to build capacity in different jurisdictions, but also for innovators to understand the regulatory environment, because some of them may have never touched financial services regulation. And what I've noticed is that regulators speak a different language to innovators. And so you also had a language barrier when you were talking about terms that a bank would know, an investment house would know. These innovators are still clueless. And it's improved a lot in the last 5 years, definitely has improved. Are we there yet? Globally, I would say not. And I think there's a lot more to go in terms of educating people in terms of the purpose of compliance, the importance and why it needs to be embraced. And the history of the space, the cryptocurrency space in particular, was done with the banks and done with regulators. So it fomented a lot of angst and distrust in some regulatory circles, which again now is diminishing. But again, the occasional scam or the FTX situation tends to create that hyper cautious approach, because the scope and scale of a crypto fraud, virtual asset fraud can go so far and so fast that smaller economies, especially like a British Virgin Islands, we can't weather that kind of shock. So, you know, there's a need for vigilance, understanding, and I think improved communication. But the good thing is it's happening. It's beginning to happen.
So one of the things that came out of our conversation last week is there's a definite distinction between the US and MiCA rules regarding the point at which the travel rule is triggered. And in the EU, it's any transaction, $0 threshold. In the US, it's 3,000. How do your jurisdictions compare to that?
Well, I can tell you, I was prepared. I did my due diligence, and so I had a look at the prior thing. The commission, I'm trying to make sure that focus. Okay, it's not going to focus. Has issued their VASP travel rule guidance so that it's clear. $1,000 US currency, which is the legal tender here, is the triggering amount. However, as was said in your last webinar, it is a risk-based approach. So the guidance makes it very clear that if a VASP service provider or intermediary has a reason to suspect something, then the travel rule would be triggered, and they would need to make sure that they get the full information on originator and, you know, make sure that that is transmitted. They also have clarified in the law and in the guidance what is necessary for VASPs to do where you still have that sunrise issue. So where a VASP may not have travel rule compliance requirements in their jurisdiction, what steps that can be taken. And of course, you can use an intermediary to help capture that travel rule information, such as TRISA. So that is also permitted to help VASPs carry out this important obligation.
Is there a requirement that there is a solution, an automated type solution in place for travel rule compliance?
It's not specified. So this again is on a risk-based approach, and it allows for flexibility of a VASP. So if a VASP has developed their own solution in-house, then and it works, then fine. But you can have a solution provided, but because regulators are hyper cautious, there must be a risk assessment being done by the VASP. There must be proper due diligence being done on that provider. Dependent on the scope and the scale of the provider, you would need to make sure that you have updated due diligence on an ongoing basis. And the regulator, which in this case would be the BVI Financial Services Commission, would need to be able to examine the wherewithal of that particular service provider. And what a lot of people don't appreciate is that when you have solutions in the VASP space, it actually has a lot of similarities to introducers or third parties. So reliance on third parties, technically you're triggering FATF recommendation 17. So, just keep reading 15, 16, and add 17. And I think that that would help service providers in terms of digesting how they can approach in getting a compliance solution.
Andrew?
Yeah, so it's very similar here, to be honest. In Hong Kong specifically, the minimum amount you need to do is 8,000 Hong Kong dollars, which is roughly 1,000 US. The Hong Kong dollar is still pegged to the US dollar, generally around 7.8, so very close to that. I'm not honestly sure about all across Asia, but I think a lot of them are very similar amounts for the minimum. In terms of providers, there's no restriction on how you comply. Hong Kong is very much there's some guidelines you need to comply with. They won't tell you how to comply with, but if you do need to, as part of the application process, you do need to explain what your policies, procedures are, and any tooling that you're using, particularly if they're third party. You need to make sure that they're fit for purpose, I think is the right thing. But you can Teresa, TRP, build your own. They're fine as long as you. It's more about, do you have the right compliance around there? And I think to the earlier point about Simone made about the difference between the crypto bros, maybe that's a quick shorthand, and the traditional finance and compliance world. It's a complete culture shock for people who've not been in there. I mean, I think the people to date, the people who have been licensed in Hong Kong have generally been from the traditional finance world or have significant staff that have been in that world, because the other people just don't get it. And it's kind of interesting from a Hong Kong specific point of view. If you look at a lot of the companies that are, some of which are no longer in business, but when the sandbox and the clear intention of Hong Kong to put a very thorough regime in, a lot of companies that had been based out of Hong Kong, I won't name them, but big names, some of the biggest ones in the world, even still, were at one point based in Hong Kong and then moved out before the licensing came in. And I think the other thing about sort of the crypto bro attitude is that I think just before the licensing came into effect, I think there's a coalition of a few of the bigger non-traditional exchanges who were already operating and thought that they could maybe convince the local regulator to weaken things and change some of their really important things to locally, and they thought they were big because they're big in crypto. They didn't really understood that that's not how regulators work, and quite a few of them dropped out at the last minute because they they couldn't convince people, and I think they were a little bit surprised. But nobody who knows anything about compliance or traditional finance was at all surprised that they couldn't change this. And there was all sorts of articles in the media that they'd obviously put out through PR people to try to influence things, and didn't really work. So it is definitely a different world. And I think if you haven't been exposed to traditional finance, it is a big learning curve. But equally, I think the regulators are now starting to fill up with people who have worked in one way or another with virtual assets, and I think that two-way learning is and converging on something that's sensible, ultimately protects citizens of jurisdictions and the world, I think is a good balance, while still allowing innovation and new products and you know, hopefully bringing more financial freedom to people in the world long term by reducing costs and disintermediation. So yeah.
So one question that comes up, and this is not travel rule specific, but maybe you can help clarify for those of us on the call who are curious, is that obviously Hong Kong has moved back under the control of the Chinese government, but I think a lot of people are trying to understand the dichotomy between the Chinese government's role or position vis-a-vis crypto in China itself versus in Hong Kong, which is doing some innovative work on the regulatory front.
Yeah, I thought that question might come up. Yeah. Well, just to put some
Anything
background.
you can do to enlighten us would be helpful.
Yeah. Look, I think one of the main reasons for Hong Kong to be a financial center is because of China. There's no doubt of that. That with China being the factory of the world, or has been for the last 20 odd years, maybe that's being taken over by other places now, but still, that's a large reason why Hong Kong exists. The trade and finance between the two places. So I think at a high level, I don't think the Beijing government, the central government as they call it, has any intention of killing Hong Kong. Now, equally, that they are very, very keen on what they call national security. And for those who have been reading about Hong Kong, there's, as of a few years back, there's this new thing called the National Security Law, which is extremely broad and retroactive, and can basically throw you in jail if you say something that's the wrong thing to say. So you have to be a little bit careful. In general, though, as long as you're not trying to overthrow the central government or breed subversion, which could begin very broadly defined, everything's fine. And in general, I'm probably being more careful than I need to because I'm on a compliance call. But you can generally have freedom of speech as long as you don't try to overthrow the government. The general commercial law is still based on the UK system. Almost all the courts and legal documents are all in English, usually with a translation to traditional Chinese or Cantonese. So in terms of how does the mainland see Hong Kong, crypto in Hong Kong versus in the mainland? Now, the government has been ridiculously supportive of the narrative of Hong Kong as a virtual asset and quote unquote Web3 hub. I don't like that term, but that's what they talk about. And that does not happen. You have had, unless the central government wants it to happen. So you've had both, major, all the major government people in Hong Kong speaking at crypto events. You've had officials from the mainland visiting those same events, and so there's no doubt that the central government is very supportive of. And sees a way, the growth in virtual assets as a positive for the economy here. Now, how they integrate that back into the mainland is something I can speculate at, but I have no inside information. I think that the history from traditional finance, there's a thing called Stock Connect, which allows people who on the Shanghai Stock Exchange are able to trade Hong Kong-based shares through that, and that's been extremely popular because it allows investors in the mainland to invest in Hong Kong stocks, and a lot of global companies are listed here or have dual listings here. So that's been very popular, and I think by having a strong regulatory regime here, which has been very deliberately and slowly introduced, I would hazard a guess that some form of access to exposure to the crypto markets, maybe not through virtual assets in and out, but maybe investments through some sort of thing like the Stock Connect might be something that may come in future. So because obviously the concerns from the central government are really, my interpretation is, it's not official, please don't throw me in jail, anybody, is that they want to protect their citizens from the crypto bros and that are going to make, pump and dump and take away all the granny's savings. But they also want to protect against capital flight out of the and particularly from organized crime and other sort of tax evasion, those type of things. So those are the dual things they want to do. So they want to do it in a controlled way, which prevents capital flight. So my betting would be something that allows them to get access to the benefits of crypto, maybe through ETFs or something like that, without direct crypto ownership and coming in. But but they're certainly interested in it. I think there's a lot of projects on things like CBDCs, which they can control more. Yeah, that's about as much as I can say.
Well, thank you. I'd like to shift now to what happens if you don't do travel rule compliance correctly. What are the consequences? Certainly, we know that they can be monetary fines. There can be other types of regulatory actions taken in the US and in the EU. So curious about your descriptions. And then I'd like to follow on, but I can come back and ask the second question, which is, as we're moving into this very prescriptive regime of travel compliance, because it is, it's very specific on what you have to do when you have to do it. Is that the beginning and the end of that compliance obligation, or are there other expectations that attach to the kind of information that you collect during the travel rule process? So
Well,
enforcement first,
speak.
and then expectations of use of information.
Well, I can tell you from talking to other people in the region that the travel rule is not a one and done. And going back to a bit of David's point in terms of the regulatory ecosystem and crypto boroughs, as he's termed them, there's so much more to compliance than just the travel rule. And so what a lot of service providers are learning from the fintech space is that there are prudential requirements that can also bar you from getting a license, or if you do get a license, can cause your license to be revoked. A lot has been said about FTX not having proper leadership, but a little bit of due diligence would have shown you that they did have a board of directors, but that was ineffective. So what that means now is that after you've had such an epic case study that I think is still being written, regulatory authorities around the world are looking very closely at the leadership and control in that particular space. As it relates to enforcement, it doesn't even matter the sector. Regulators are ratcheting up enforcement measures in terms of the quantum of fines and penalties, as well as the gravity of actions. And there are two reasons for that. In my opinion. One is that there are some firms who have seen enforcement action as a cost of doing business and keep behaving badly anyways. And one particular entity that I've cited for almost a decade now without fail is Wells Fargo. They just keep showing up for sometimes the same issues. And then you have the pressure of standard setters and FATF in particular, when they do their reviews, looking at whether enforcement action is sufficiently dissuasive to prevent bad behavior. What fintech service providers and TradeFi service providers are going to have to grapple with is that technology is going to be that double-edged sword, because technology, now you have soup tech that's going to be used to be more nuanced in the reviews of fintech service providers, and especially for VASPs. If you want to have your license in any jurisdiction within the region do expect blockchain analytics to feature as part of the review process. And as a service provider, again, fintech or TradFi, you have to have mechanisms in place for transaction monitoring. You have to have mechanisms in place for quick suspicious transaction reporting and report it to the right FIUs, because again, now with the multi-jurisdictional reach of a lot of the VASPs, sometimes the issue is that it's not being reported in the right place. That's an issue that's come out. I believe it was an Egmont report, which is the group of body for FIUs globally. But I'll stop there and I'll let David jump in, and we could always double back on that.
Yeah, no, again, it's very similar here. It certainly doesn't stop at the travel rule. Definitely blockchain analytics, full sanctions checking, all the detailed KYC, especially if it's an entity going down to all the beneficial owners. It's just, again, the principle here is this same product, same risk, same rules. So everything you do in traditional finance, you have to do in crypto. In terms, you talked about things like what happens with the travel rule data. Hong Kong actually has very strict privacy rules, and very strong penalties, regardless if it's crypto or not, if you don't take good care of that data. So yeah, there's very strong penalties if you get that wrong. In terms of penalties for travel rule itself, I haven't really seen any of those yet, because we're only sort of 5 months or so into the official being legislation period. Prior to that, there was an exchange which basically scammed a lot of people in Hong Kong. This was before it was compulsory, before the legislation came in, and the local regulator did get in a lot of PR problems because they didn't prevent those people being scammed here. And that interestingly enough, for example, prior to that, they hadn't listed which exchange, because it wasn't law yet. They hadn't, the same way as they don't do it in traditional finance, they didn't list the people who had actually applied but not yet been given a license in Hong Kong prior to that scam happening. And the media here jumped on that because they said, well, these people were saying, they were saying that they were legit, sort of, but there was no way of telling, because there was no way of telling whether they had applied and whether they were, doing anything or not, because it wasn't listed. And very soon after that, the list of people who had applied, people who had applied and been rejected or withdrawn, was added to the website of the local regulator here. So a little bit more transparency in there based on that. But yeah, basically, full compliance required, and I do expect investigations and enforcement take time, and if you're not licensed in Hong Kong, or on in the process of being, and you cannot operate in Hong Kong, and you cannot market to or onboard Hong Kong clients.
Well, and I think what we heard in the last webinar was that the importance of integrating the data that you acquire in the travel rule information collecting process, and making sure that you're looking at that data, incorporating it into your suspicious activity monitoring program, your sanctions compliance process, and so on, so that and it sounds like that's consistent elsewhere. I think, Andrew, I'd like to turn quickly, and I know we're approaching the bewitching hour, let's go back to the interoperability. Why is that interoperability issue a challenge and a really a priority for addressing?
Yeah, good question. So I mean, the challenge as a VASP is that you have an obligation to comply with the travel rule, and if the VASP if a user wants to send coins or withdraw coins to a different VASP that is using a different travel rule solution, to you and there is not interoperable, then everything falls back to manual operations, and that can just be very, very expensive, particularly and impractical for a retail exchange that might be sending, you know, you might have to do like $500 worth of compliance work for a $50 withdrawal or something. It doesn't make sense, and hence why a lot of the exchanges are pushing, where they're allowed to, not all exchanges can, to use self-hosted wallets. But that doesn't, you know, obviously that kind of defeats the purpose of the why are we doing travel in the first place, to prevent, you know, money laundering, terrorism, modern slavery, that sort of stuff. I mean, I genuinely believe, even though it's not 100% effective, if it saves one person, it's a good thing to save. So it's not the great thing, and this is where open standards, permissionless, the same way as crypto, open source, really allows any individual VASP with the resources to implement something themselves, and gain interoperability with anybody else who does that, and also our friends, the vendors who we love, may be able to implement it as well. So if you have the Envoy product that Edwin and Benjamin have created, completely open source. It's got implementation of Teresa and TRP in it, and anybody, any VASP can take that code. The Envoy they can just run as a product itself. Great work, Edwin. But the code they can even take and extend and build in there, and then suddenly from going between local islands, if the other VASPs implement some of those strategies, maybe as well as another solution, then suddenly you can send direct from VASP to VASP, and get all the protections that gives to the poor human slaves that are around the world still. Is that a good answer?
Simone, I see you nodding in agreement. I guess a closing question for you is, what's the future of self-hosted wallets in this travelable compliance world?
Well, you're going to have your due diligence done on you, and it's a question that I've considered because I have my own wallet, and thinking, extrapolating how that will be applied. There will be mechanisms for people to have their self-hosted wallets, but it be identified as being owned by someone, and there'll be incremental checks, because of course you can pass, or I could pass my ledger on to my brother or my nephew or whatever. So I think the regulatory nuance that I spoke about is going to develop to address those issues. Certainly in the BVI, the guidance that was issued by the commission has in how a VASP should deal with unhosted wallets versus self-hosted wallets, and what's in scope and what's not in scope. And that type of clarity definitely helps, because as we've both been off saying, some of the service providers in this particular space still are compliance newbies. So, they would look at the regulatory community as tech newbies, but we both have a lot to learn. And I think that will evolve as the next iteration of refinement for recommendations 10, 15, and 16.
I'd like to make sure that I've been monitoring closely any questions from our audience. If there are any other questions, now's your time. And while you're typing that in, I would like to ask for last thoughts on where we are in the travel rule process in your area of the world, and what you see as the next steps, the most important immediate steps for folks.
Well, okay, thank you. Thank you, Andrew. The next and most immediate steps, get educated on both sides of the fence. This would be a shameless plug for Ignis Solutions. And it is important for people to understand the purpose of compliance, because there's still resistance to compliance because people don't understand what the intent is. And I loved hearing Andrew's vantage point in terms of why why you do these things, you know, to prevent all of the harms, the sex trafficking, the human trafficking, you know, and there's so many more crimes that happen that people facilitate with fiat and with cryptocurrency. If you're a service provider, regardless as to what side of the fence you're on, it's really, really, really important for you to have clean data and to have really good data management systems, because as we go forward in this 21st century, the state of your data and you being able to intelligently interrogate your data for something that we might not be able to think about right now is critical for us to be nimble enough to prevent new crimes that we haven't imagined as yet, as well as making sure that we allow for global trade to flourish.
Andrew?
Well said, and that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a cliche in the crypto world, but I think we are still early on this stuff. I do think the MiCA things, which will take probably, you know, at least a year, but probably more like a couple of years to really roll out, I think is a turning point because of the size of the economies over there. I think we're probably going to be another 5 years before we really see maturity of the travel rule space. And but I do also think over that 5-year period, we're probably going to have another boom and then a bust. But to some degree, I think the integration of traditional finance with all the ETFs and you know, the tokenization and things, which finally seems like it might actually come. I do think that you're going to get a polarization between the regulated and compliant virtual asset world and the crypto bro world. And I think the crypto bro world won't disappear, but it may be a much smaller percentage of the market. And I think having the FATF and you know, reasonably harmonized legislation across the jurisdictions gives, as best as we can, a level playing field that doesn't as much as it has, you know, the last 5 years. I think it's really disadvantaged the compliant players. You know, most of the biggest volume trading in crypto is not on compliant exchanges, and I'm hoping that in 5 years' time, because of the integration to the wider financial system, that's reversed, and you know, that we do have more flows going through compliant things, and as I both want, you know, less people being turned into slaves and harmed and bombed and all that bad stuff. It won't be. I mean, I have a 19-year-old daughter, and people say, you know, you only might put 99% of the organized crime stuff will still go through. But if my daughter was human trafficked, I wouldn't care if I can save her or somebody else's daughter, and that's the 1% of whatever that's done. I'd be happy. So that's the way I see it. Of course, it's not effective. Most of the money laundering or the bad stuff happens in traditional finance, but doesn't mean we should give up, and we should do our best. And I think Simone's point about having high data quality, which, you know, with all the interesting things happening in AI and stuff, it may be that the same way as, you know, unwinding, you know, the blockchain analysis has enabled us to trace things that were previously thought to be anonymous or semi-anonymous. I think there may be some good things that happen with that technology as well to make the world a better place.
Well, I very much like to thank our speakers for, I think, some very insightful and sobering commentary. I think you've set us up well for the next session. I think, Simone, you do get the prize for the phrase of the day, intelligently interrogating, which is not just what you pick up in your suspicious activity monitoring, your general customer due diligence, but the travel rule information is very much part of that intelligent interrogation. Obviously, and that's where it sets us up nicely for our next conversation, is that runs dead smack into some of the ethos in the crypto space, which is if not privacy, or if not anonymity, at least significant privacy. And so we will focus the next time on that question of the security of the data, especially when you're transferring from one party to the other, as well as the ability of the other party to be able to maintain the security of the data, as well as the privacy related issues. But you have definitely left, both of you, and our thanks to you for this, has left us with a lot to think about as we move forward into that next discussion. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing everyone at the next webinar.
Thanks.
Thanks.